Whispers Beyond the Black Root, a tale of Middle-earth. In the waning days of the Third Age, when the shadows of Mordor had long been cast down and peace had settled upon the lands of Gondor, like morning dew upon the meadows of Lebanon, there came word to Minas Tirith of strange happenings in the southern reaches of the realm. The tale begins not with the clash of steel nor the thunder of cavalry, but with whispers that carried upon the wind from the dark valleys beyond the Black Root. Boromir, son of Denethor, was dead these many years, fallen in defense of the little ones at Amon Hen. Yet his memory lived on in the hearts of the rangers who patrolled the wild lands of Gondor. It was to one such ranger, Hurin of Lossarnach, that the first signs of unrest came, as he kept watch from the heights of the Pinnith Gelen. The autumn mists had grown thick in the valleys, thicker than any had seen in living memory, and within them moved shapes that defied the natural order. Farmers in the scattered settlements spoke in hushed tones of cattle, found wandering in circles, their eyes white as milk, and of wells that had run dry overnight, though they had flowed clear for generations untold. Hurin was a man weathered by long years in the wild places, his cloak gray as the stones of the mountains, his sword keen as the mountain wind. When he received the summons to ride south to investigate these disturbances, he felt a chill that had naught to do with the seasons turning. For in his dreams of late, he had heard whispers in a tongue that was not of men, nor of elves, nor of any folk that walked beneath the light of sun and stars. The ranger gathered his company, Thorindir of Dol Amroth, whose lineage traced back to the Sea Kings of old, Barahir the Young, eager for deeds that might earn him renown, and Damroth, a woodsman whose knowledge of the southern vales was without peer. Together they rode from Minas Tirith under the banner of the White Tree, their horses' hooves echoing against the stones of the great gate as they passed beneath it. 7 days they rode through the fair lands of Lebanon, where the Anduin runs broad and deep toward the sea, and with each mile southward, the very air seemed to grow heavier, as though weighted with some unseen burden. The birds grew silent in the trees, and even the horses began to step with greater caution, their ears pricked forward as if listening to sounds their riders could not perceive. On the evening of the 7th day, they came to the village of Erenvorn, which stood at the mouth of the Blackroot Vale. Here dwelt shepherds and farmers, folk of simple virtue, who asked naught but to tend their flocks in peace. Yet when Hurin and his companions rode into the village square, they found it all but deserted. Only one figure moved among the empty houses, an old woman, bent with age, who drew water from the well with movements slow and deliberate. "Good mother," called Hurin, dismounting from his steed, "we are rangers of Gondor, come at the king's behest to investigate reports of strange happenings. Tell us, where are your people?" The woman turned, and Hurin saw that her eyes held a fear deeper than any he had witnessed, even in the dark days of the War of the Ring. "Gone," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dead leaves. "All gone into the vale." Following the whispers, they heard the calling in their dreams, and at dawn they walked into the mist, every man, woman, and child, save only I. "What whispers?" pressed Thorindir, his hand instinctively moving to his sword hilt. "The voices from the deep places," she replied, her gaze turning toward the dark mouth of Blackroot Vale. "They speak of things that were, and things that shall be, and things that should never have been wakened. The stones themselves cry out in tongues long forgotten, and the very roots of the earth shift and writhe as though in pain." That night, the rangers made camp outside the village, keeping watch in turns, as was their custom. But sleep, when it came, brought no rest. Each man was visited by dreams of darkness, of vast halls carved from living rock, and of something ancient stirring in the depths, something that had slumbered since the elder days but now began to wake. Dawn came pale and wan to Erenvorn, filtering through mists that crept down from the vale like fingers of some grasping hand. The rangers broke their fast in silence, each man wrapped in his own thoughts, all sensing that they stood upon the threshold of events that would test them beyond measure. As they prepared to enter Blackroot Vale, Hurin gathered his companions about him. "We go now into unknown peril," he said. his voice grave. "The mists that shroud this place are not natural, and I fear that what lies beyond may challenge all that we have learned of the world. Yet we are rangers of Gondor, sworn to ward this realm against all threats. Let each man look to his weapons and his courage, for I deem we shall have need of both ere this day is done." The mouth of the vale was narrow, flanked by steep walls of gray stone that rose like silent sentinels into the mist. The Blackroot River, which in former days had run clear and swift, now moved with a sluggish current that seemed almost thick as oil, and its waters had taken on a hue that spoke of corruption at its source. As they rode deeper into the vale, the mist closed about them like a living thing, muffling sound and sight, until they might see no more than a few paces in any direction. Their horses grew increasingly restive, snorting and sidestepping as though they sensed some presence in the swirling vapor. It was Damrod who first noticed the trees. The woodsman had ever been keen of eye, able to read the signs written in bark and leaf, as others might read the writings of scribes. "Look well upon these oaks," he said, pointing to the great trees that lined their path. "See how their branches turn not toward the light, but bend away from it, as though they flee from some terror within the vale itself." Indeed, the ancient oaks seemed to recoil from the deeper reaches of the valley, their limbs twisted into shapes of anguish, and their leaves, though it was yet autumn, had taken on a pallor that was neither gold nor brown, but the color of old bone. They had ridden perhaps 3 leagues when they came upon the first of the missing villager. A young shepherd lay beside the path, his face turned skyward, his eyes open but seeing naught. He breathed still, yet deeply, as one lost in profound slumber, and no effort on the part of the rangers could rouse him. "He lived," said Barahir, kneeling beside the sleeper. "Yet it is a life that seems to hang by the slenderest of threads. See how his breath comes slow and measured, as though he were caught between waking and sleeping, between the world we know and some other realm entirely." More sleepers they found as they pressed on, scattered along the path like leaves before a storm. Men and women, children and aged, all lying in the same deep slumber, their faces bearing expressions of wonder and terror intermingled. Some smiled as though beholding visions of great beauty, while others bore looks of horror that spoke of nightmares beyond mortal comprehension. The path began to rise, winding upward through stands of pine and birch, whose branches drooped with moisture from the ever-present mist. Strange sounds echoed from the depths of the valley, not the natural voices of stream and wind, but low moanings that seemed to rise from the very stone and occasionally carried on the still air, the sound of chanting in a language that predated the coming of men to Middle-earth. As the day wore on, the mist began to thin, revealing glimpses of the vale's upper reaches. What they saw there filled them with foreboding, for the very landscape seemed changed, as though the earth itself had been reshaped by some tremendous force. Where once had stood the familiar contours of hill and dell, now rose formations of black stone, twisted into shapes that hurt the eye to look upon. Near eventide, they came to a place where the path divided. One branch led downward toward the source of the Blackroot, while the other climbed higher into the mountainous country beyond. It was here that they made camp, though none felt easy in that place, for the very ground beneath them seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched not the beating of their hearts, but something far more ancient and alien. That night, as Thorindir kept the first watch, he beheld a sight that would haunt him to his dying day. In the depths of the mist below, lights began to dance, not the warm glow of flame or star, but cold radiances that shifted through colors unknown to mortal eyes. And with the lights came voices, singing in harmonies that spoke of ages when the world was young, and the Valar walked openly upon Arda. The second day in Blackroot Vale dawned without true sunrise, for the mist had thickened during the night until it formed an impenetrable shroud above their heads. The Rangers found themselves in a twilight world where time seemed to flow differently, where moments stretched like hours and hours passed like heartbeats. Hurin chose the upward path, reasoning that whatever force lay behind these strange happenings, it would likely make its seat in the high places where the old powers once held sway. The path grew treacherous as they climbed, winding between boulders that bore strange marking, not runes such as the dwarves carved, nor the flowing scripts of the elves, but symbols that seemed to shift and change when looked upon directly. It was Barahir who first heard the whispers clearly. The young ranger had dismounted to examine one of the carved stones when suddenly he stiffened, his head tilted, as though listening to some distant voice. "Do you hear it?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. They speak of the early days when the music was first sung and the world took shape. They tell of the discord that marred the harmony and of those who were cast down into the void. His companions gathered round him, but though they strained their ears, they heard naught but the soft susurrus of mist against stone. Yet Barahir continued to listen, his eyes growing wide with awe and terror intermingled. "They say that not all who fell were lost," he continued, his voice taking on a dreamy quality. "Some found refuge in the deep places of the earth, in caverns beneath the roots of mountains. There they waited and watched and learned to sing new songs, songs that could reshape the very foundations of Arda." Thorondir grasped the young ranger by the shoulder, shaking him gently. "Barahir, what voices do you hear? Who speaks to you in this place?" But Barahir seemed not to hear his comrade's question. His gaze had turned inward, as though he beheld visions invisible to mortal sight. "The firstborn knew," he whispered. "Before they sailed west, they sought to bind the sleepers in chains of song and stone. But their work was incomplete, their binding flawed. And now, as the fourth age dawns, the old constraints weaken." A chill ran through Hurin's heart at these words, for he recalled the lore of the elder days when mighty powers strove against the foundations of the world. If such forces were indeed stirring in these mountains, then the peril facing Gondor was greater than any had imagined. They pressed on, though with growing unease, for Barahir's condition worsened as they climbed higher. The young ranger walked now as one in a trance, his lips moving constantly as though he held converse with unseen companions. Sometimes he would laugh with delight at some vision only he could perceive, while at other times his face would contort with terror and he would cry out warnings in the tongue of Gondor, mixed strangely with words in languages unknown. The path led them at last to a great amphitheater carved from the living rock of the mountain. Here, in ages past, some forgotten people had hewed seats and platforms from the stone, creating a place where thousands might gather to witness great events. But now, the amphitheater was filled with a sight that chilled the blood of the rangers. Row upon row of sleeping forms, the missing villagers arranged in perfect order, as though placed there by invisible hands. At the center of the amphitheater stood a raised dais, and upon it was carved a great spiral that seemed to draw the eye ever inward. As the rangers approached, they felt a strange compulsion to join the sleepers, to lay down their burdens and surrender to the dreams that beckoned from beyond the veil of waking consciousness. Damrod, whose will was strong and whose knowledge of woodcraft had taught him to read the subtle signs of enchantment, struck his sword against a stone, creating a sharp sound that broke the spell that had begun to weave itself about them. "This is fell magic," he declared, his voice ringing clear in the still air. "Some power seeks to gather these folk for a purpose we do not yet understand. But see, they are not merely sleeping. Look closer at their faces." Indeed, as the rangers examined the sleepers more carefully, they saw that each bore an expression of rapt attention, as though they listened to words of ultimate importance. Their eyes moved beneath closed lids, following sights beyond mortal perception, and occasionally their lips would move in silent speech. "They dream," said Hurin, understanding dawning in his mind. "But they dream not their own dream. Something speaks to them, fills their minds with visions and voices. But to what end?" The answer came from Barahir, who had wandered to the edge of the dais and now knelt before the great spiral, his hands pressed against the carved stone. "They learn," he said, his voice carrying an echo that had not been there before. "The sleepers learn the ancient song, the words of making and unmaking. When enough have learned, when the chorus is complete, Then shall the deep singers rise from their long slumber, and the world shall be remade according to their design. As night fell over the ancient amphitheater, though in truth it was difficult to discern the passage of time in that shrouded place, the rangers made camp at a distance from the sleeping multitude. They dared not light a fire, for fear of drawing unwanted attention, and so they huddled together in the cold darkness, sharing what warmth they could while keeping watch over their ensorcelled companion. Barahir had grown worse as the day progressed. He spoke now in voices that were not his own, sometimes in the measured cadences of elven speech, sometimes in the harsh syllables of tongues that belonged to the elder days. Most disturbing of all, he had begun to sing wordless melodies that seemed to harmonize with sounds none of the others could hear, as though he were part of some vast choir that existed beyond the boundaries of mortal perception. "We must get him away from this place," urged Thorandir, his noble features creased with worry. "Whatever power holds sway here grows stronger with each passing hour. I fear that if we linger much longer, we too shall fall under its influence." But Hurin shook his head grimly. "Would that we could, my friend, yet see how the mist has thickened around us. I tried to retrace our path during the day, but every way I turned led only back to this accursed place. We are caught in some web of sorcery, held here until its purpose is fulfilled." Damrod, who had been examining the carved symbols around the amphitheater's rim, returned to their makeshift camp with troubling news. "I have found writings," he reported, "though they are in no script I recognize. Yet, through some art I cannot fathom, their meaning comes clear to me when I gaze upon them. They tell of the Athrabeth, the deep singers who dwelt in Arda, before the coming of the children of Iluvatar." He paused, his weathered face grave in the dim light. "According to these writings, they were not servants of the Dark Lord, but beings of another order entirely. When the Valar shaped the world according to their vision, the deep singers withdrew to the roots of the mountain, for their own song was different, not evil perhaps, but alien to all that we know and cherish. And now they wake?" asked Hurin. "The writings speak of a time when the barriers between the seen and unseen worlds would weaken," Damrod continued. "The sleepers we see here are being taught to sing their song, to add mortal voices to their choir. When the teaching is complete, the deep singers will rise, and their music will reshape Arda to match their ancient vision." A low moan echoed across the amphitheater, seeming to rise from the very stones beneath their feet. The sleeping multitude stirred as one, their lips moving in unison as they gave voice to harmonies that predated the music of creation. Barahir rose from where he sat, his eyes still closed, and began to walk toward the dais at the center of the great circle. "Stop him!" cried Thorandir, leaping to his feet. But as he reached out to grasp his friend, his hand passed through empty air. Barahir had become translucent, his form wavering like a reflection in troubled water. The young ranger walked with measured steps to the great spiral carved in the stone dais. As he approached, the carving began to glow with a cold light that hurt the eyes to look upon. When he reached the center, he raised his hands above his head and began to sing in a voice that was no longer entirely his own. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The sleeping villagers began to rise, their eyes still closed, but their movements perfectly coordinated. They filed down from the stone seats in orderly processions, forming concentric circles around the dais. As they took their places, they too began to sing, their mortal voices blending with Barahir's to create harmonies that seemed to make the very air shimmer and dance. From the depths of the earth came an answering song, so deep and powerful that it could be felt rather than heard. The stones of the amphitheater began to resonate in sympathy, and cracks appeared in the ancient masonry as forces beyond mortal comprehension stirred in the darkness below. Hurin drew his sword, though he knew not what enemy he might face with steel. The blade, forged in the workshops of Gondor and blessed by the priests of the White Tree, began to glow with its own light, a warm radiance that stood in stark contrast to the cold emanations from the carved spiral. "The hour is upon us," he said to his remaining companions. Whatever power we face, we must find the courage to stand against it. If these deep singers truly mean to remake the world, then all we love and cherish hangs in the balance. But even as he spoke these brave words, Húrin felt his own will beginning to weaken. The alien music tugged at his mind, promising visions of wonder beyond imagining, offering knowledge that would make him more than mortal. It took all his strength to resist the call, to hold fast to his purpose and his loyalty to the realm he served. The song was reaching a crescendo now, and with it came the first glimpse of the deep singers themselves. They rose from crevices in the stone floor, beings of shadow and starlight, their forms shifting and indistinct, yet possessed of a terrible beauty. They moved with grace beyond mortal comprehension, their hands weaving patterns in the air that left trails of light behind them. As they sang, reality itself began to bend and warp around them. The walls of the amphitheater stretched and flowed like water, revealing glimpses of vast caverns that extended far beneath the mountain. In those depths moved other figures, countless numbers of the deep singers, all adding their voices to the great work of transformation. The transformation of the amphitheater continued throughout the night, as the deep singers shaped reality with their alien music. What had been solid stone became fluid, flowing and reshaping itself according to their will. The ancient seats carved by forgotten hands dissolved and reformed into configurations that hurt the mind to perceive, geometries that existed in more dimensions than mortal eyes could comprehend. Húrin and his companions found themselves trapped within this maelstrom of change, their very bodies beginning to respond to the otherworldly harmony. Thorandir felt his thoughts becoming clearer and sharper, as though veils were being lifted from his perception. Yet with this clarity came a growing sense that his human nature was slipping away. Damrod watched in fascination as his hands became translucent, the lines of age and weather fading as something far older took their place. "We are being remade!" gasped Húrin, struggling to maintain his sense of self against the transformative power of the song. "They do not destroy, they reshape all things to match their vision. We must find a way to break their hold, or we shall cease to be what we are and become something else entirely." At the center of the chaos, Barahir had become a conduit for powers beyond mortal comprehension. His form blazed with ethereal light, and when he spoke, his words carried harmonics that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to the soul. "Do not resist," he urged his former companions, though his voice carried the alien cadences of the deep singers. "See what wonders await. The boundaries that limit your kind shall be cast down, and you shall know the universe as it truly is, in all its infinite complexity and beauty." Yet even as Barahir spoke these words, Húrin detected something else in his friend's transformed voice, a note of desperate pleading, as though some part of the young ranger's original self remained trapped within his altered form. This realization sparked a plan born of desperation and hope. Drawing upon all his training as a ranger, Húrin began to sing a counter-melody, not in harmony with the deep singer's alien music, but in deliberate discord. He sang the songs of his homeland, the ballad of Gil-galad, the lament for Boromir, the ancient hymns of the Númenórean. These were songs of mortality, of brief lives lived in courage and love, of sacrifice and loss, and the precious beauty of things that fade. The effect was immediate. The flowing transformations around them slowed, as though meeting unexpected resistance. The deep singers turned their attention to this new element in their composition, their shifting forms focusing upon the ranger who dared to introduce dissonance into their perfect harmony. Thorandir and Damrod, understanding their captain's intent, added their own voices to his song. They sang of the Shire's green hills, of the towers of Minas Tirith gleaming in the morning sun, of children playing in the streets of peaceful villages. These simple, mortal images seemed to strike at the very heart of the deep singer's alien nature. The transformed Barahir staggered as conflicting forces warred within him. The part of him that had been touched by the deep singer's power yearned to embrace their transcendent vision, while his mortal nature clung to memories of fellowship and duty, of laughter shared with comrades, and tears shed for the fallen. "Remember who you are," called Hurin, his voice cutting through the otherworldly harmonies. "Remember the oath you swore to defend the realm of Gondor. Remember your father's name and the village where you were born." For a moment, it seemed that their effort might succeed. Barahir's form solidified, his human features becoming clear once more. The sleeping villagers stirred uneasily, as though awakening from deep dreams. Even the deep singers themselves paused in their song, their shadowy forms wavering with uncertainty. But their hesitation lasted only an instant. With renewed determination, they began to weave new patterns into their music, harmonies that embraced the discord Hurin had introduced, and transformed it into something even more complex and beautiful. The Rangers' countersong was absorbed into their greater composition, becoming merely another voice in their cosmic choir. "You understand so little," said the transformed Barahir, though whether he spoke in pity or contempt was impossible to determine. "You cling to your brief mortal existence as though it were precious, yet you know not what you sacrifice in your ignorance. The deep singers offer immortality, not the static preservation of your current forms, but endless growth and change, infinite expansion of consciousness and capability." The walls of the amphitheater had now dissolved entirely, revealing the true scope of the deep singer's domain. Vast caverns stretched away in all directions, their walls carved with symbols that seemed to move and breathe with a life of their own. Throughout these spaces moved countless forms, some recognizably the transformed shapes of mortals who had fallen under the deep singer's influence, others so changed as to be alien beyond description. "Behold the city of Nith-Hith-Aglir," continued Barahir, gesturing toward the impossible vista that surrounded them. "Here dwell those who have accepted the gift of transformation. They have put aside the limitations of flesh and bone, of brief years and narrow perception. They are become part of something greater, eternal, unchanging, perfect." Yet even as he spoke these words, Hurin detected something in the transformed landscape that filled him with hope. For all its alien beauty, for all the power and wonder it displayed, there was something static about this realm. The moving symbols repeated their patterns endlessly. The transformed beings followed the same graceful routines without variation. It was perfection, perhaps, but it was also a kind of death, the death of growth, of surprise, of the sweet unpredictability that made mortal life precious. As the transformation of reality continued around them, Hurin found himself thinking of the old woman they had met in Erenvorn, the one person who had not answered the call of the Whispered. Why had she alone remained immune to the deep singer's influence? What quality did she possess that had allowed her to resist their otherworldly allure? The answer came to him as he watched the perfect choreography of the transformed beings in the caverns around them. The old woman had been touched by sorrow, deep, personal loss that had marked her soul with scars that could never fully heal. She had buried children, mourned a husband taken by war, watched friends and neighbors fade with age and infirmity. Her mortality was not an abstract concept, but a lived reality, written in every line of her weathered face. This realization sparked a desperate plan. If the deep singer's power lay in their promise of transcendence, of escape from the pain and limitations of mortal existence, then perhaps their weakness lay in their inability to truly understand what they sought to transform. They offered perfection, but they had never known imperfection. They promised eternal joy, but they had never experienced loss. "Damrod!" Hurin called to his companion, who was struggling to maintain his corporeal form as the transformative energies washed over him. "Think of your wife, taken by the plague 5 winters past. Remember how you held her hand as she slipped away, how her last breath felt against your cheek." The woodsman's eyes widened with understanding, and he began to recall not the happy memories of his marriage, but the agonizing pain of its ending. As he did so, his translucent form began to solidify once more, the deep singer's alterations retreating before the raw power of genuine grief. "Thorindir," Hurin continued, his voice growing stronger as he saw his strategy taking effect. "Remember the fall of Osgiliath, the friends we could not save. Remember the children we found too late, the villages that burned while we were elsewhere. The noble ranger's face contorted with remembered anguish, but with that pain came a return of his essential humanity. The ethereal glow that had begun to surround him faded, replaced by the familiar solidity of mortal flesh. The effect upon the Deep Singers was immediate and profound. Their perfect harmonies faltered as discordant notes crept into their song. Not the deliberate discord that Hurin had first introduced, but something far more fundamental. The pure, crystalline beauty of their music was being contaminated by the messy, complicated emotions of mortal life. Barahir, standing at the center of the great spiral, began to tremble as conflicting forces warred within him. The transcendent vision of the Deep Singers still called to him, promising escape from all pain and limitation. But now, awakened by his companion's words, came flooding back the memories that made him truly human. The death of his brother in the War of the Ring, the girl he had loved but could not save from fever, the quiet desperation he had felt watching his father grow old and frail. "No," he whispered, and his voice was his own once more. "I remember now. The pain is part of who we are. Without it, we are nothing. Perfect, perhaps, but empty." The Deep Singers' song rose to a crescendo of desperation as they felt their perfect creation beginning to unravel. The transformed villagers began to stir, their synchronized movement becoming erratic as individual consciousness reasserted itself. The geometric perfection of the cavern city started to crack and crumble as mortality reasserted its chaotic influence. But the Deep Singers were not yet defeated. With voices that shook the very foundations of the mountain, they began a new song, not one of transformation or transcendence, but of binding and compulsion. If they could not win their subjects through the promise of perfection, they would chain them with bonds of supernatural force. The air around the rangers became thick and viscous, pressing against them like invisible chain. Their thoughts grew sluggish, their will to resist sapping away as the Deep Singers' power bore down upon them. Even the memories of loss and pain that had protected them began to fade, becoming distant and unreal. It was then that an unexpected voice joined the cosmic battle. The old woman from Erenvorn had somehow found her way to the cavern city. She stood at the edge of the great space, her bent form tiny against the alien grandeur that surrounded her. But her voice rang out clear and strong as she began to sing a lament for her lost children. Her song was not beautiful in any conventional sense. It was cracked with age, rough with grief, marked by all the imperfections of a mortal throat shaped by decades of sorrow. Yet it carried a power that the Deep Singers' perfect harmonies could not match. The power of authentic experience, of love that persisted even in the face of inevitable loss. The effect upon the Deep Singers was catastrophic. Their forms began to waver and dissolve as the old woman's lament introduced an element they could not absorb or transform, the willing acceptance of mortality, with all its pain and beauty. She was not trying to escape her human nature or transcend her limitations. She was embracing them, celebrating them even in their tragedy. One by one, the Deep Singers' voices faltered and fell silent. Their shadowy forms retreated to the deepest cavern, seeking refuge from the unbearable reality of mortal emotion. The transformed cavern city began to collapse back into ordinary stone, its impossible geometries resolving into familiar shapes. As the Deep Singers retreated into the uttermost depths of the earth, their hold over the amphitheater and its assembled multitude began to weaken. The alien architecture that had replaced the ancient stone seats flowed and shifted, slowly resolving back into recognizable form. Yet, the transformation was not complete. Traces of the otherworldly influence remained, carved into the rock like scars that would endure for ages to come. The sleeping villagers began to stir, their synchronized movements giving way to the natural restlessness of those emerging from deep slumber. Some wept as they awoke, mourning for visions of transcendent beauty that faded like morning mist. Others laughed with relief at finding themselves still human, still bound by the familiar limitations of mortal flesh. Barahir stood swaying at the center of the great spiral, his form flickering between human and something far more ethereal. The battle between his mortal nature and the Deep Singer's influence was not yet fully resolved, and Hurin could see that his young companion fought a desperate struggle within his own mind. "Help me," Barahir pleaded, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke of vast spaces between the stars. "I can still hear them calling. They show me wonders beyond imagining, cities that exist in 7 dimensions, music that could reshape the foundations of reality. Part of me still wants to follow, to become what they offer." Hurin approached his friend cautiously, for the air around Barahir still shimmered with otherworldly energy. "What they offer is real," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I do not doubt the wonders they could show you, the powers they could grant. But tell me, in all their visions of perfection, was there laughter? Was there the simple joy of sharing a meal with friends? Or the satisfaction of a task well completed?" Barahir's ethereal glow flickered as he considered these words. "No," he whispered. "There was beauty, but it was cold. There was knowledge, but it brought no joy. They speak of transcendence, but they have forgotten what it means to be glad for small things." The old woman from Erenvorn had made her way down to the amphitheater floor, moving slowly but with purpose among the awakening villagers. She helped a young mother rise to her feet, steadied an old man who swayed with confusion, offered words of comfort to children who cried for parents they could not immediately see. "You broke their power," Hurin said to her, wonder in his voice. "How did you resist when so many others could not?" She looked up at him with eyes that held the wisdom of long suffering. "I had nothing left to lose," she replied simply. "They promised to take away my pain, but my pain is all I have left of those I loved. To lose it would be to lose them entirely." As understanding of her words sank in, Hurin felt the last pieces of the puzzle fall into place. The Deep Singers were not evil in the way that mortal minds understood evil. They genuinely believed they were offering a gift. But they were so far removed from the mortal experience that they could not comprehend the value of imperfection, the beauty that lay in transience and loss. Around them, the awakening continued. Villagers embraced family members with tears of joy, their relief at finding themselves still human evident in every gesture. The rangers moved among them, offering assistance and reassurance, though many questions remained about how they would return to their homes and what they would remember of their strange sojourn. Thorindir approached one of the carved walls where ancient symbols still glowed faintly with residual power. "What of these markings?" he asked. "Should we not attempt to destroy them, lest they serve as a gateway for the Deep Singer's return?" But Damrod, whose woodcraft had taught him to read the subtle signs of natural and unnatural influence, shook his head. "The symbols are fading already," he observed. "Without constant reinforcement from the Deep Singer's presence, they will become mere carvings once more. Perhaps it is better to leave them as a warning for future generations, a reminder that not all gifts should be accepted, no matter how beautiful they appear." As the mist that had shrouded the veil began to lift with the coming of true dawn, the rangers prepared to lead the villagers back to Erenvorn. Many of the people moved as if in a dream, still processing the visions they had witnessed during their enchanted sleep. Some spoke of cities beyond the stars, others of music that could reshape reality with a single note. Barahir remained the most affected, his form still flickering occasionally between solid and translucent. The transformation he had undergone was not easily reversed, and Hurin worried about the long-term effects of his friend's exposure to the Deep Singer's influence. "I can still hear them," Barahir confided, as they prepared to leave the amphitheater, faintly, like voices calling from across a great distance. "They are not defeated, merely withdrawn, and I sense that our encounter with them has changed something fundamental, not just in us, but in the balance of forces that shape Middle-earth." Indeed, as they looked back at the ancient stone seats, now scarred with alien symbols that would never fully fade, all the rangers felt that they had witnessed something of cosmic significance. The Deep Singers represented a power older than Sauron, different from the malice of Morgoth, a force that offered transcendence at the cost of everything that made life worth living. The sun broke through the dissipating mist, as they began their descent, painting the world in familiar colors of gold and green. Yet for those who had witnessed the alien beauty of the Deep Singer's realm, even the most ordinary sunrise would forever carry echoes of otherworldly wonder. The journey back to Erenvorn took longer than their ascent into the Vale, for the awakened villagers moved slowly, still dazed by their otherworldly experience. Many stopped frequently to stare at simple things: the bark of a tree, the flight of a bird, the play of sunlight on water, as though seeing such sights for the first time. The Deep Singer's visions had shown them realities beyond mortal comprehension, and now the familiar world seemed both precious and strange. As they descended from the heights, Hurin found himself walking beside the old woman who had broken the Deep Singer's hold. Her name, he learned, was Morwen, and she had lived in Erenvorn for nigh on 70 years, arriving as a young bride from Lossarnach in the days when King Elisar first took the throne. "You spoke truly when you said you had nothing left to lose," Hurin observed as they picked their way down a rocky slope. "Yet I sense there is more to your resistance than mere resignation to loss." Morwen was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands gripping a staff worn smooth by years of youth. "3 children I bore," she said at last, her voice carrying the cadence of old grief. "2 sons taken by war, a daughter by the wasting sickness. My husband passed 5 winters ago, calling their names with his last breath. The Deep Singers promised to reunite me with them, to grant me the power to undo what time and fate had wrought." She paused to rest against a boulder, her eyes distant with memory. "But I realized, as I listened to their whispers, that what they offered was not truly my loved ones returned. They would reshape me, reshape my memories, until I no longer knew the difference between what was real and what was merely wished for. Better to carry the true weight of loss than to embrace a perfect lie." Her words struck deep into Hurin's heart, for he too had lost much in his years of service to Gondor. The Rangers lived hard lives, often watching helplessly as the people they protected suffered and died. The temptation to escape such pain, to find refuge in the Deep Singer's perfect realm, was not easily dismissed. Barahir, walking a little ahead of them, had been listening to their conversation. His form had stabilized somewhat during the descent, but he still bore marks of his transformation. His eyes held flecks of starlight, and his voice carried harmonics that spoke of vast spaces between worlds. "I felt it too," he said, turning to face them. "The promise of reunion with all we have lost. But there was something hollow about their vision of eternity. They offered endless existence, but not true life. Their perfection was static, unchanging, beautiful perhaps, but sterile." As the day wore on, other members of the rescued group began to share their experience. A young shepherd spoke of visions where his lost flock had been transformed into creatures of living starlight, more beautiful than any earthly animal, but lacking the warm reality of wool and flesh. A miller's wife described seeing her deceased mother, but one who had been remade according to the Deep Singer's ideal, flawless and eternal, yet somehow no longer truly herself. The pattern was consistent. The Deep Singer's gifts always came at the cost of authentic existence. They offered transcendence, but only by abandoning everything that made life meaningful to mortal hearts. By evening, they had reached the outskirts of Erenvorn, where the villagers were reunited with the few who had remained behind, mostly the very young and the very old, those whose minds had proven less susceptible to the otherworldly calling. The joy of these reunions was tempered by the knowledge that the experience had changed everyone involved, marking them with memories of otherworldly wonder that would never fully fade. That night, as the Rangers made camp outside the village, they held council to discuss what should be reported to the authorities in Minas Tirith. The king would need to know of the Deep Singer's existence, but how could they convey the true nature of the threat without causing panic or despair? "They are not evil as we understand evil," Thorondir mused, staring into their small campfire. "They do not seek conquest or domination, nor do they delight in suffering. In their own way, they believe they offer salvation, which makes them more dangerous, not less," replied Damrod grimly. Sauron's malice was obvious. All who possessed any wisdom could see the corruption in his works. But the Deep Singers offer genuine beauty, real transcendence. Their temptation is far more subtle. Hurin nodded thoughtfully. We must find a way to warn against their influence without describing it too precisely. Knowledge of their gifts could itself become a trap, leading others to seek them out in hopes of finding what we rejected. They decided to compose their report carefully, emphasizing the danger while minimizing the details that might inspire unwanted curiosity. The Deep Singers would be described as ancient powers hostile to mortal life, their specific nature left vague. The villagers' experience would be reported as a form of enchantment, the true wonder of the otherworldly vision kept secret. As they discussed these matters, Barahir sat apart from his companion, his altered eyes fixed on the stars that wheeled overhead. Hurin could see that his young friend wrestled with inner turmoil, the competing claims of his human nature and the otherworldly knowledge that had been forced upon him. "What troubles you, lad?" Hurin asked, moving to sit beside him. "I remember things I should not know," Barahir replied softly. "The songs that shaped the foundations of Arda, the true names of stars that have not yet been born, the pathways between the circles of the world. The knowledge burns within me like a fever, demanding expression. Yet I fear that to speak of such things would be to spread the Deep Singer's influence like a plague. It was a problem that would have no easy solution. Barahir had been fundamentally changed by his encounter with the otherworldly power, marked with knowledge that existed beyond the boundaries of mortal understanding. Whether he could find a way to live with such burden remained to be seen. 3 days after their return to Erenvorn, a new complication arose. Word had somehow spread of the strange events in Blackroot Vale, and scholars from across Gondor began arriving to investigate. They came from the houses of healing in Minas Tirith, from the libraries of Dol Amroth, even from the archives of Isengard, where Saruman's texts had been preserved for study. Leading this scholarly expedition was Master Cardolan, a learned man whose studies of ancient lore had earned him recognition throughout the realm. He was elderly but vigorous, with keen eyes that missed little, and a mind that categorized and analyzed everything he encountered. "Rangers," he greeted Hurin and his companions with formal courtesy, "I have been sent by the steward himself to investigate reports of unusual phenomena in this region. I trust you will provide full cooperation in this matter of utmost importance to the security of the realm." Hurin felt a chill of foreboding at these words. He had hoped to keep knowledge of the Deep Singers limited to those who had witnessed their power firsthand. But now it seemed that curiosity and official concern were drawing unwanted attention to the site. "What exactly have you heard, Master Cardolan?" he asked carefully. The scholar consulted a leather-bound journal filled with precise notes. "Reports speak of an entire village falling into enchanted sleep, of ancient powers stirring in places long thought dormant. There are rumors of visions and voices, of transformations that border on the miraculous. As a student of the Elder lore, I find these accounts fascinating in the extreme." It was precisely the reaction Hurin had feared. The scholar's eyes gleamed with intellectual hunger, the dangerous curiosity that had led many to seek out powers better left undisturbed. He exchanged glances with his companions, seeing his own concern reflected in their faces. "The danger has passed," Thorindir said diplomatically. "The villagers have awakened and returned to their homes. Whatever force troubled this place has withdrawn." But Master Cardolan was not so easily dissuaded. "Ah, but the question remains, withdrawn to where? And might it not return? Surely the scholarly community has a responsibility to understand such phenomena, that we might better guard against them in future." Over the following days, despite the rangers' attempts at discouragement, the scholarly expedition established a camp near the entrance to Blackroot Vale. They brought with them instruments for measuring and recording, texts of ancient lore for comparison, and most dangerously of all, an unshakable conviction that knowledge was always preferable to ignorance. Barahir watched these preparations with growing distress. The otherworldly knowledge that burned within him allowed him to perceive things his companions could not. He could see the way the scholars' probing questions created tiny resonances in the fabric of reality, like ripples spreading outward from a stone cast into still water. "They do not understand what they seek," he confided to Hurin one evening as they watched the scholars poring over their texts by lamplight. "Their very curiosity creates pathways for the deep singers to follow. With each question they ask, each theory they propose, they weaken the barriers that hold the otherworldly powers at bay." Indeed, there were already signs that something was stirring in response to the scholarly investigation. The mist had begun to gather again in the upper reaches of the vale, and sensitive individuals among the villagers reported strange dreams. Most troubling of all, some of the scholars themselves had begun to speak of revelations that came to them in sleep, fragments of cosmic truth that their mortal minds struggled to comprehend. Master Cardolan had become particularly obsessed with the carved symbols they had found in the ancient amphitheater. He spent hours making precise drawings of each marking, comparing them to similar symbols found in texts dating back to the elder days. His excitement grew with each connection, each pattern he identified. "These carvings predate the coming of men to Middle-earth," he announced to his colleagues one morning, his voice trembling with scholarly passion. "They represent a form of writing more ancient than the scripts of the elves, more fundamental than the runes of the dwarves. If we could decipher their meaning, think what knowledge might be revealed." Hurin knew they had to act before the scholars' investigations went too far. That night, he sought out Master Cardolan in his tent, finding the old man hunched over his drawings by the light of an oil lamp. "Master Cardolan," he said formally, "I must speak with you of matters touching upon the security of the realm." The scholar looked up, his eyes bright with fevered curiosity. "Ah, Ranger, have you come to share what you truly witnessed in the depths of the Vale? I sense there is much you have not told us." "There is," Hurin admitted, "and for good reason. The power that stirred in this place is not one that benefits from study or understanding. Some knowledge is too dangerous to pursue." But Master Cardolan laughed, a sound tinged with the dangerous certainty of one who believed learning could solve any problem. "Dangerous knowledge? My dear fellow, knowledge itself is never dangerous, only ignorance. The more we understand these ancient forces, the better equipped we shall be to defend against them. And if your understanding attracts their attention, if your very questions serve as an invitation for them to return." The scholar's expression grew serious for a moment, but then he shook his head dismissively. "You speak as a soldier, thinking only of immediate threats. I speak as one who seeks to comprehend the deeper patterns that govern our world. These symbols, these carvings, they represent a form of knowledge that could revolutionize our understanding of reality itself." Hurin realized that words alone would not dissuade the man. Master Cardolan had been consumed by the same dangerous curiosity that had led others to seek forbidden knowledge throughout the ages. The only question was whether they could prevent him from awakening forces better left to slumber. As he left the scholar's tent, Hurin found Barahir waiting for him in the darkness. The young ranger's form flickered slightly, his connection to otherworldly realms making him visible to senses beyond the merely mortal. "It may already be too late," Barahir said softly. "I can feel them stirring, not the deep singers themselves, but their servants, the thoughts and dreams they planted in mortal minds during the first awakening. The scholar's questions are like keys turning in locks that were meant to remain sealed." The signs began subtly, so subtly that at first only Barahir, with his otherworldly sensitivity, perceived them. The carved symbols in the amphitheater, which had faded to mere scratches in stone after the deep singer's retreat, began to glow faintly once more. The mist in the upper vale thickened and took on strange colors that shifted with no earthly light to explain them. More disturbing were the changes in Master Cardolan and his scholarly companion. Their research had taken on an obsessive quality, with the men working through the night by lamplight, their voices growing fevered as they discussed theories that bordered on the incomprehensible. They spoke of dimensional matrices and temporal harmonic, using terms that seemed to come from nowhere, as though knowledge was being fed directly into their mind. "We are on the verge of a breakthrough," Master Cardolan announced to anyone who would listen, his eyes bright with an unnatural gleam. These symbols represent more than mere writing. They are formulae for reshaping reality itself. If we can unlock their secrets, we could solve every problem that has ever plagued mortal existence. Hurin watched these developments with growing alarm. He had seen this pattern before. The gradual seduction of curious minds by powers beyond mortal comprehension. The Deep Singers were using the scholars' own intellectual pride as a weapon against them, feeding them tantalizing fragments of cosmic truth that demanded ever deeper investigation. The situation came to a head when Master Cardolan announced his intention to perform what he called a practical test of his theories. He had identified what he believed to be an activation sequence among the carved symbol, a pattern that might awaken dormant energy in the ancient amphitheater. "This is madness," Thorondir protested when he learned of the plan. "You toy with forces you do not understand." But the scholar was beyond reason now, his mind consumed by otherworldly knowledge that masqueraded as scholarly insight. "Understanding comes through experimentation," he replied with the certainty of one whose thoughts were no longer entirely his own. "We shall proceed at dawn, when the celestial configurations are most favorable." That night, the Rangers held urgent council. They could not allow the scholars' experiment to proceed, yet neither could they simply abandon their duty to protect the realm from supernatural threats. The situation required delicate handling. Too much force might trigger the very catastrophe they sought to prevent. "We could arrest them," suggested Damrod. "Hold them until the madness passes." "And if it does not pass," countered Hurin, "if the Deep Singer's influence has taken too deep a hold, we would merely be postponing the inevitable." Barahir, who had been silent throughout their discussion, finally spoke. "There may be another way," he said softly. "The otherworldly knowledge they possess. I share it as well, but I have learned to resist its call. Perhaps I can reach them, show them the true cost of the transcendence they seek." It was a dangerous plan, requiring Barahir to open his mind to the very forces that had nearly claimed him in the amphitheater. But with dawn approaching and Master Cardolan's experiment imminent, they had little choice. As the first light of morning crept into the vale, the scholarly expedition made their way to the ancient amphitheater. They had brought with them instruments of brass and crystal, devices constructed according to principles gleaned from their study of the carved symbols. These they arranged in precise patterns around the great spiral at the center of the stone dais. Master Cardolan stood before the largest of the symbol, his hands raised in gestures that seemed to mirror the alien configurations they had been studying. His voice, when he began to speak, carried harmonics that no mortal throat should have been able to produce. The effect was immediate. The carved symbols blazed to life with cold fire, their light casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. The air itself began to thicken and shimmer, as though reality were becoming fluid once more. It was then that Barahir stepped forward, his own form beginning to glow with the otherworldly radiance that marked his transformation. "Stop!" he called out, his voice carrying across dimensions to reach not just the scholar's ears, but their very soul. "You do not understand what you summon." Master Cardolan turned, his face alight with fanatic joy. "But I do understand. The Deep Singers offer us the chance to transcend our limitation, to become more than merely human. Why should we cling to mortality when immortality awaits?" "Because," Barahir replied, his form flickering between human and something far more ethereal, "I have seen their realm of perfect beauty, and I know what it costs. They do not preserve what makes us human. They replace it with something that resembles us, but lacks the essence of who we truly are." As he spoke, Barahir allowed his transformation to proceed further, his human form becoming translucent as otherworldly energies played around him. But unlike during his first encounter with the Deep Singers, he maintained his essential self, using their power while remaining true to his mortal nature. The scholars watched in fascination and growing horror as Barahir demonstrated the reality of transcendence, beautiful beyond description, but cold and empty of the warm chaos that made life worth living. In his transformed state, he possessed knowledge that spanned galaxies and power that could reshape world, yet he was diminished rather than enhanced, having traded the precious imperfection of humanity for an alien perfection that meant nothing. "This is what awaits you," he said, his voice echoing across multiple dimensions. "Not the preservation of who you are, but the replacement of your authentic selves with perfect copies that lack your essential humanity." The Deep Singers do not lie when they promise transcendence, but they cannot comprehend why such transcendence might be unwanted. One by one, the scholars began to understand. Master Cardolan was the last to accept the truth, his scholarly pride warring with the evidence before his eyes. But even he could not deny what Barahir's demonstration had revealed, that some gift came at too high a price, that the pursuit of ultimate knowledge might lead to the loss of everything that made knowledge worthwhile. As understanding dawned, the Deep Singers' influence began to weaken. The carved symbols flickered and dimmed, their otherworldly radiance fading back to mere scratches in ancient stone. The transformed instruments of the scholarly expedition cracked and crumbled, their alien configurations unable to maintain cohesion without the power that had originally inspired. With the immediate crisis averted, the Rangers and the chastened scholars faced a decision that would echo through the ages. The knowledge of the Deep Singers' existence could not be simply forgotten. Too many had witnessed their power, felt their otherworldly influence. Yet neither could such knowledge be allowed to spread unchecked, lest it inspire others to seek out the transcendence that had so nearly claimed Master Cardolan and his companion. Barahir, still partially transformed by his encounter with otherworldly forces, found himself at the center of this dilemma. The cosmic knowledge that burned within his mind made him perhaps the only mortal capable of understanding the true scope of the threat the Deep Singers represented. "They are not merely another power to be defeated," he explained to the assembled group as they sat in the ruins of the ancient amphitheater. "They exist outside the normal patterns of good and evil as we understand them. They genuinely believe they offer salvation, and in their own terms, they do. But salvation from the mortal condition requires the destruction of everything that makes mortality precious." Master Cardolan, his scholarly pride humbled by his narrow escape from otherworldly influence, listened with the attention of one who had learned wisdom through near catastrophe. "Then how do we guard against them? How do we protect future generations from their seductive call?" It was Morwen, the old woman from Erenvorn, who provided the answer. She had remained in the Vale to tend to those villagers still recovering from their otherworldly experience, and her words carried the weight of authentic suffering. "We remember," she said simply. "We remember that loss and pain and imperfection are not flaws to be corrected, but essential parts of what makes us who we are." The Deep Singers cannot understand the beauty that lies in transience because they have never truly lived. They have only existed. Her words sparked a plan that was both elegant and necessary. Rather than attempting to suppress all knowledge of the Deep Singers, they would create a different kind of record, not a technical description of their powers or methods, but a testament to the value of mortal existence with all its apparent limitations. The scholars, led by Master Cardolan, would return to their libraries and archives with a new purpose. They would compile stories of human courage and sacrifice, of love that persisted despite loss, of beauty found in imperfection. These tales would serve as a kind of spiritual armor against the Deep Singers' influence, reminding future generations why mortality was worth preserving. Horin and his rangers would file their official report with the king, but in carefully chosen terms that emphasized the danger without revealing the specific nature of the temptation. The focus would be on the importance of remaining true to human nature, rather than seeking otherworldly transcendence. Most importantly, a new order of guardians would be established. Men and women who had witnessed the Deep Singers' power firsthand and understood both its allure and its ultimate emptiness. They would watch for signs of the otherworldly influence and stand ready to counsel those who might be tempted by visions of perfect transcendence. Barahir, despite his transformation, chose to remain among these guardians. The otherworldly knowledge within him was a burden he would carry for the rest of his days, but it also made him uniquely qualified to recognize when the Deep Singers' influence began to stir once more. "I have stood at the threshold between worlds he told his companions as they prepared to leave Blackroot Vale for the final time. "I have seen the perfect realm the Deep Singers offer, and I understand its appeal. But I have also learned that perfection without the possibility of growth, beauty without the shadow of loss, knowledge without the humility that comes from uncertainty. These are not gifts, but curses in disguise." As they made their way down from the amphitheater, each member of the group carried with them the memory of cosmic forces that lay just beyond the borders of ordinary existence. They had faced a threat unlike any other, not evil seeking to destroy, but a form of transcendence so alien to human nature that accepting it would mean ceasing to be human in any meaningful sense. The carved symbols in the stone would fade with time, becoming once more mere curiosities for scholars to debate. The mist would lift from the veil, allowing the Blackroot to run clear once more. But the knowledge of what lay beneath the foundations of the world would remain, passed down through generations of guardians who understood that some doors must never be opened, no matter how beautiful the realm that lay beyond them. Yet even as they walked away from the amphitheater, Barahir could still hear the Deep Singers calling from the depths of the earth. Their voices were fainter now, but not silent. They waited with the patience of beings who measured time in geological ages, ready to respond when mortal curiosity or despair once again made minds receptive to their otherworldly gifts. The true battle, he understood, would never end. Each generation would face the choice between accepting the limitations of mortality or seeking transcendence that came at the cost of everything that made existence meaningful. The Guardians could offer guidance and wisdom, but ultimately, the choice would always rest with individuals faced with the eternal question: what did it truly mean to be human? Years passed after the events in Blackroot Vale, and the memory of the Deep Singers began to fade from common discourse. The official records spoke only of ancient influence that had been contained through the courage of rangers and the wisdom of scholars. The true nature of the otherworldly threat was known only to the small circle of guardians who had witnessed it firsthand. Barahir established himself in a tower on the borders of Lebanon, where he could watch the southern approaches and monitor the subtle signs that might herald the Deep Singers' return. His transformation had stabilized over time, leaving him appearing largely human, but possessed of senses that extended beyond mortal perception. He could hear whispers in the wind that carried otherworldly harmonics, and see in the night sky patterns that spoke of cosmic forces stirring in distant realms. The Order of Guardians grew slowly, carefully selecting new members from among those who had demonstrated both courage and wisdom in the face of supernatural threats. They established outposts throughout Gondor and beyond, always watching for the signs that their ancient enemy was stirring once more. Master Cardolan had returned to his studies, but with a transformed perspective. His scholarly pursuits now focused on documenting the triumphs of mortal spirit, acts of love and sacrifice that demonstrated the unique value of human existence. His greatest work, The Mortal Crown, became a cornerstone text for the Guardian, reminding them why their vigil was necessary. Morwen lived out her remaining years in Erenvorn, tending to those who still bore the marks of their otherworldly experience. Some of the former sleepers occasionally reported dreams of cosmic beauty, but these visions no longer held the compulsive power they once possessed. The old woman's example had taught them to find meaning in their limitation rather than seeking escape from them. It was in the 15th year after the events in Blackroot Vale that the first new stirrings were detected. A young scholar at the University of Minas Tirith reported dreams of vast libraries containing knowledge beyond mortal comprehension. A craftsman in Dol Amroth began creating works of impossible beauty, his hands guided by inspirations that seemed to come from beyond the circles of the world. Barahir responded to these reports with the urgency of one who understood their true significance. The Deep Singers were testing the barriers once more, reaching out through dreams and visions to find minds receptive to their influence. The pattern was familiar, the gradual seduction of intellectual pride, the promise of transcendence that would ultimately strip away everything that made existence meaningful. But this time, the Guardians were ready. They reached the affected individuals before the otherworldly influence could take deep hold, offering not suppression of their experience, but understanding of their true cost. The scholar was shown the empty perfection that lay at the heart of ultimate knowledge, while the craftsman learned that beauty, without the possibility of flaws, was not beauty at all, but a kind of sterile imitation of life. The crisis was contained, but its implications were troubling. The deep singer's influence was spreading in new ways, adapting to the Guardians' countermeasure. They had learned to be more subtle, their whispers carrying just enough truth to make their deceptions believable. Hurin, now advanced in years but still vigorous in his duty as a ranger, visited Barahir in his tower to discuss these developments. The two men stood on the battlements, looking out over the peaceful lands of Gondor. As the sun set behind distant mountains, they grow more cunning, Hurin observed. No longer do they call entire villages to sleep, but rather seduce individuals one by one, building a network of influenced minds. Barahir nodded, his otherworldly senses perceiving patterns his companion could not see. They have learned from their previous failure. The direct approach awakened too much resistance. Now they work more subtly, offering small transcendences that seem harmless, but prepare the way for greater transformations. Can they be stopped permanently? Hurin asked. Is there any way to silence their call forever? It was a question Barahir had pondered for many years, and the answer he had reached was both disturbing and strangely hopeful. I do not believe they can be destroyed or permanently silenced, he said slowly. They are too fundamental a part of the cosmic order, the eternal temptation to escape the limitations of mortal existence. But perhaps that is as it should be. Hurin frowned at this unexpected response. How can their presence be desirable? Because, Barahir replied, his voice carrying harmonics of otherworldly knowledge. The choice they represent is what makes us truly human. Every generation must decide whether to accept the beautiful imperfection of mortal life or to seek the sterile perfection of transcendence. That choice defines us more than any other aspect of our nature. As if summoned by their discussion, a faint whisper carried on the evening wind, not words that could be understood, but a melody that spoke of wonders beyond imagination. For a moment, both men felt the familiar tug of otherworldly longing, the promise of escape from all pain and uncertainty. But they had learned to recognize the call for what it was, and they turned away from it without regret. Their vigil would continue, not just to protect others from the deep singer's influence, but to preserve the essential humanity that made such protection necessary. In the tower's archive, carefully preserved records told the story of that first encounter in Blackroot Vale. Future Guardians would read these accounts and understand the true nature of the threat they faced. But more importantly, they would learn to value the very mortality that made them vulnerable to otherworldly temptation. For in the end, the greatest defense against the Deep Singers was not knowledge of their powers or methods, but appreciation for the irreplaceable worth of imperfect, transient, gloriously human existence. The whispers would always be there, calling from beyond the circles of the world, offering transcendence to those who would listen, and humanity's answer would always be the same. We choose to remain what we are, flawed and mortal, and beautiful in our very limitations. The vigil continued, as it would for all the ages to come, a guardian's watch against the seductive promise of perfect emptiness. And in that eternal choice between transcendence and humanity, the true meaning of mortal existence was forever affirmed.